Committee on the Rights of the Child is an independent body that is established by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 196 countries. We're also currently working on getting the last country that remains to ratify, which is the United States of America. It's truly a global document, and the monitoring role that we play as the committee ranges from Article 1 up to the last substantive provision, which is Article 41. Now, the issue of children deprived of their liberty is an issue that we engage with almost all state parties that come before the committee. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has been central in relation to the process of the global study on deprivation of liberty. In fact, I do recall when the proposal came from a few stakeholders, we had a meeting in the committee room. There was a letter that was written by our chairperson at that point in time, Professor Kristen Sandberg of Norway, practically asking and requesting that there is authorization to start this study. We have engaged with the issue of children deprived of their liberty in a number of thematic contexts. We have done this, for instance, when we adopted a joint general comment with the Committee on Migrant Workers and in the context of international migration, and we've actually spent a significant amount of time there trying to cover the issue of detention, which has significant impact on the lived reality of children that find themselves in the context of international migration. We have dealt with the issue when we did the general comment on children in street situations. And again, within that context, it's a very important issue. In the majority of instances, our experience shows that the children that are often deprived of their liberty are children who come from marginalized societies, who find themselves in vulnerable groups, including children that are in street situations, minorities. There are a number of examples of also cases where children with disabilities and others in vulnerable circumstances find themselves where they are deprived of their liberty. So it's not an issue that has come up just recently. It's an issue that the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been engaging with the issue since the creation of the committee in the early 1990s. Now, there are a few issues that I believe are important to flag in this respect. First of all, the jurisprudence of the Committee on the Rights of the Child in relation to children deprived of their liberty is predominantly focused on children in the justice sector. So one of the added values that this global study will bring to the fore to the jurisprudence and work that the committee is doing, it actually gives us a more solid ground to further systematically extend our engagement on the issue in the context of institutions, in the context of children that are deprived of liberty as a result of terrorist acts or as a result of an armed conflict. It will help us the opportunity to look at some thematic issues again in a systemic manner. For instance, what are the health implications for children that are deprived of their liberty? What are the various issues that arise in the context of children with disabilities when they are deprived of their liberty? What are some of the peculiarities that we need to take into account when we're dealing with issues of girls that are actually deprived of their liberty? What are some of the critical issues that get raised in the context of immigration detention? And as I've already said earlier, immigration detention is a very critical issue, and the committee has engaged with this issue in a more systemic manner, particularly beginning for the last few years, since the time we adopted the joint general comment. One of the criticisms that we have often given to states is that immigration detention is done without taking into account the best interest of the child, without making sure that there is an individual assessment. In the joint general comment, one of the points we emphasize is that we say that immigration detention for children is not in the best interest of the child. And some states have made the argument that we are making the criteria and the principle in relation to the best interest of the child as being the primary consideration. That's not the point. After all, when the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of the Child was done, there was a clear indication that the best interest of the child is a primary consideration. But in the meantime, the point that we're trying to make is that when we talk about a primary consideration, it is not just one of the considerations. We do believe, as the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it's one of the top considerations that needs to be taken into account when dealing with children's issues. So if there are countries whose immigration policies are very much predominantly focused on national security and other considerations at the cost of children's best interest, and if it emphasizes or even allows deprivation of liberty for children solely on the basis of immigration violations, then the Committee on the Rights of the Child is of the view that often this does not comply with the requirement to make children's best interests a primary consideration. One of the cascading positive effects that we also do anticipate coming from the global study is that it will help states that are state parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child to actually improve their whole child protection system, including their child justice system. For instance, there are a number of offenses that are in the books of a number of state parties that should not necessarily be there. For instance, offenses that are status offenses, criminalization of abortion, criminalization of different sexual acts involving children among themselves within persons below the age of 18 and so forth. And these often have a very negative effect in terms of leading children to come in conflict with the law. And this could often lead to children being deprived of their liberty. So one of the positive spin-offs that we do anticipate coming from this study is that it will help us to address a number of the issues that have arisen in the context of the review of state party reports by the Committee on the Rights of the Child that have direct implications in the context of juvenile justice system. And this study will help to provide the data, to provide some of the good practices, but also to provide the political impetus for states to look at generally their child protection system, but also in particular their juvenile justice system, so that once again it is in compliance with recent developments globally, including neuroscience and some of the information that is coming from fields other than law, but also making sure that the kind of environment within which children operate, be it in the juvenile justice system, in alternative care, or national security measures that are being implemented in a number of countries, do not go against the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. One of the additional added values that I do anticipate will come from the global study is that how it will help to influence informal justice systems. There are a number of instances, including or even in particular the part of the world that I come from, which is Africa, where the informal justice system plays a very significant role in upholding children's rights, in creating access to justice closer to the people at the grassroots level. But in the meantime, there are few occasions where the informal justice system might not necessarily comply with the international standards and regional standards that are provided within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. So one of the added values that will obviously come from this global study is to consolidate the point that even in the context of deprivation of liberty, informal justice systems have a very significant contribution to make. And in the instances where the informal justice systems are not in compliance with the regional and international standards, then obviously they need to be brought in line with what state parties have bound themselves by ratifying these instruments. When we talk about child justice systems, we also need to take into account the fact that often resources are limited, the geographical location and the geographical situation of countries would have significant implications. The extent to which traditional systems are in place could also create a bit of a synergy. And even though as a Committee on the Rights of the Child we emphasize the point that there needs to be a proper child protection system, that there needs to be a proper child justice system, we are also not oblivious to the fact that some states, because of the attendant circumstance they have, might not necessarily be in a position where they can bring about a system, a very wide, well-defined and clearly demarcated system that would actually comply in full with the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there are occasions where, for instance, in the context of small island states, which do not necessarily have the human and financial resources, that the committee has given an indication that as long as there is no violation of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they need to take into account some of the infrastructure that they have put in place with a view to create the kind of infrastructure, the kind of standards and the kind of system that would respond to the needs of children within that specific country and within that specific context. The Committee on the Rights of the Child is currently reviewing General Comment number 10 on children's rights in juvenile justice. There are a number of reasons that have actually necessitated the review of that general comment. It is from 2007, between 2007 and now 2019. There have been a number of significant developments that have taken place throughout the world in terms of research, in terms of policy, in terms of practice, and so forth. So the committee felt the need to take into account its attendant circumstances and update general comment number 10. That general comment, which is being updated, will obviously reflect on the issue of children deprived of their liberty. And there is obviously a very close link between what the committee is doing in relation to updating that general comment and the global study that is currently being finalized. And the timing couldn't be any better because the global study would most probably be finalized before the Committee on the Rights of the Child finalizes its review of the general comment. And once a draft of the global study is available, inevitably the committee will take into account some of the information that has come from the global study, not just only in respect of children deprived of their liberty, but a whole range of other areas that have implications in relation to child justice within the framework of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The global study is also an opportunity to reinforce some standards that are relevant and available within regional human rights instruments. In fact, what is provided within the Convention on the Rights of the Child are the minimum standards. And if one looks at Article 41 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it talks about the so-called more conducive provision or more conducive environment. It mentions that if a state has a higher child rights obligation under domestic law or under other international law, then actually the convention welcomes that. So in relation to the issue of deprivation of liberty of children, for instance, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child under Article 30 provides for a very high standard pertaining to children that are imprisoned with their parents. So in this respect, the possibility for the global study to take developments within regional arrangements that are of a higher standard is something that is welcomed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child under Article 41, but also by the jurisprudence of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The global study also offers the Committee on the Rights of the Child to refine the so-called general principles, best interest of the child, non-discrimination, the right to life, survival and development, but also child participation, and their relevance and application in relation to deprivation of liberty. For instance, child participation is absolutely critical. What are the experiences of children that are deprived of their liberty? What are some of the views that they can offer? What are some of the feedbacks that we're actually supposed to give to children once they have offered their views on the experience of deprivation of liberty? So these are issues that in our engagement with state parties that come before the committee that we will be able to integrate, not just only when we deal with Article 37 and Article 40, but also when we deal with a number of other provisions, in this particular case, the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. One of the significant challenge that we face as the Committee on the Rights of the Child in our engagement with states on the issue of children that are deprived of liberty is the issue of data. Not just data, but disaggregated data and on the basis of sex, urban, rural, age, and a whole range of other indicators. We're not just only interested in relation to the so-called stock data, but also in relation to flow data. Now, the global study will inevitably help the Committee on the Rights of the Child fill some of this gap. And once the global study is available and some of the reflections on data are provided, it will be important, and we will definitely follow up on this as the committee, it will be important for the committee to make use of that information with a view to guide the legislative, administrative, and other appropriate measures that states need to undertake in relation to data collection, data analysis, data storage, and the extent to which data is actually used to inform both law, policy, and practice.